as illustrated in the movie The Lives of Other People, which you also love.
Right. Oh my God. Yeah, that was fantastic. Right. That's actually a hugely powerful point. Meaning, you're saying that the way you would distinguish yourself from him is that he wasn't able to hold on to, something that he genuinely believed in. In other words, when he lost his ideals, he didn't have a sense of transcendence. For him, let me try and play out what you're saying. So let's try and put ourselves in his head for a second. In his worldview, this world is all there is.
Mm-hmm.
And so once he's disappointed with his experience of this world and profoundly disappointed, there's nothing left.
Right.
He's got no place else to turn. He's got no larger vision. He's got no, until he gets completely lost.
Right.
I think that's great.
I'll give another example. I mean, for instance, I still believe in Dennis Prager, even if Dennis Prager does not believe in me. Like, Dennis Prager is my favorite intellectual and has been for about 19 years. We had a personal falling out in late 1997, which has not affected in any way my high regard for his thinking. And so I'm able to, still admire his intellect, and at the same time, I'm not going to be totally crushed that I fell out with him. The fault may be 75% mine, but, I will soldier on. I'm not going to be crushed and devastated and think that I'm a worm because I fell out. So I think you can still, realize that people can be great in some areas and have flaws in others, and you can still admire them for the areas where they're great. And you can admire yourself for the areas where you're great and not, neither trash yourself for your flaws nor adulate yourself for your strengths.
Right. No, I think that's true. I mean, I guess the question would be, again, what is, and maybe we're going to do that in our, Yom Kippur dialogue before Yom Kippur. The question is, in the way that a person, that anyone lives, in the way that we live, what is our moral code, and how does it work, and how do we, in other words, are we subject to a moral code that we kind of all agree on, or do we all each kind of create our own very subjective moral code? And there's probably some mixture of the two. The Torah obviously is a beautiful, gorgeous, divinely, expressed, moral code that kind of binds all of us. So kind of, as the Talmud points out in a number of places, everyone has the places where they're stronger and weaker in the Torah. So the Torah has, the Gemara has an idea that everyone picks one mitzvah, and that's their special mitzvah. That's it's called the mitzvah miyuchedet, their unique mitzvah, their unique commandment, in which for which they have to be willing to die for. In other words, that usually the law is, if you remember, the Talmud and Sanhedrin, right there in 74a, the Talmud says you only give up your life for the big three, incest, idolatry, and murder, right? And for everything else, it's better to violate and be around to fight another day, right? So there's a very powerful idea that already exists in the early sources and really gets exquisitely formulated in my teacher, Mordechai Leiner of Izbeka, who says that every person also has a unique mitzvah which is directly related to them, and they're the only person who know what it is. And for that mitzvah, you also have to give up your life. And what he means by that is that defines your life. That's who you are. So clearly, everyone has a different relationship, and everyone focuses on a different area. Having said that, there still is a universal kind of code of ethics, and there it's a really interesting question. So how does that play into, and this is a different conversation, how does that play into blogging, and what are the rules of blogging, and how do I make up those rules, and how do I decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, particularly because you're in a field, I'm just a simple author, you're in a field, where you're kind of blogging to the world, about all sorts of people, all sorts of things, and hopefully your blog's getting some ratings there, so that's all good. So you really have to have a very rigorous, and I imagine you've evolved with this, and this is, the subject of a different debate, or a different dialogue, not really a debate. But, you have to have a really rigorous code of, what goes on a blog and what doesn't go on a blog, and, really you have to be a psychologist, an ethicist, a political strategist to know why people are telling you things, etc. You're not in a simple position, my friend, and you also don't have a board of overseers. You're completely autonomous and independent. So, you're in a very complex, postmodern position where you basically create your own pulpit, as it were. You can speak to quite a lot of people, and therefore just the ability to talk, creates a certain amount of power, which creates a certain amount of responsibility, with a rapid independence. That's a very long way of saying that, whoa, that's a big deal.
Yeah, I think actually it's a lot simpler than that, in that if you blog with your name on it and you belong to a decent community, most of your moral questions are solved right there. Like, there are severe limits on what I can do because I belong to an Orthodox Jewish community, not just a particular synagogue, but I live in Pico Robertson. I walk these streets every day. I blog with my name on it. I will bear the brunt of my misdeeds, in a very visceral way. So I think when you do things with your name on it, and you also have connections, a community, and hence vulnerabilities, that does solve most, though not all, of the moral questions.
I guess where we would disagree is I think that solves about a quarter of them. Right? In other words, the nature of the Orthodox community, the community that I know well, right, is like any other community. It has beauty and it has loveliness, and it also has corruption, and as people are in and people are out, and Orthodoxy hides many sins, and you can get away with an enormous amount, on a blog of inaccurate, information, without anyone, kind of saying a word, as long as it doesn't affect their immediate friends and their immediate people. That's just the fact. We both know that that's empirically true. So I think I agree with you that there's some sense of check when you're part of a community. That's a fair and powerful point. Where I would kind of radically disagree with you, empirically, I think it's verifiable, is the level of the check. For example, this is something that you ran into a couple of weeks ago. If you out someone who's working for the Los Angeles Jewish Journal, so people may get upset with you. I have no idea what the story was, but all in all, I don't think you caused any damage to the person. It didn't affect the course of anyone's life. And people got upset because it was in their own little community. So it wasn't actually an ethical outrage. It was more of a kind of, protecting the turf. On the other hand, you or somebody else, let's depersonalize it, could say, 20 things that are completely wrong about someone, and as long as that person's not part of their community, they couldn't care less. So I'm not sure that it solves most of the problems. I would actually, respectfully challenge that.
Yeah, I would say it does, in the sense that there are enormous consequences for getting important things wrong on a blog, and the consequences may not be immediate, and they may not be within your community. But as a blogger, you're also part of a family of bloggers, or a wider community of bloggers. And when someone wants to take you down, they then look for the stories you've gotten wrong to use that against you. So there is a formidable checks and balances when done under your own name, but it's by no means a complete check and balance.
Right. Well, let's, I think we're getting on. I appreciate the response. We're kind of off the movie here, so I'll bring us back to it. I would just maybe ask the last question, which maybe we can handle in a different dialogue, which is just, I think it's a fascinating question, which is, I know myself, I think I've changed in the world. I think I've grown as time's gone by. I think, there's places where I think I made mistakes, and I say, hey, I made a big mistake there. I think I really fucked up there. That's a Talmudic phrase, by the way. And like, I gotta fix that. And I've evolved in different ways. In other ways, I've kind of held firm, with what I've believed for 25, 30 years. So would you view yourself as evolving? Like, in other words, is Levi Ford today, as a blogger, would you view yourself as having ethically evolved in the last decade?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not sure. In many ways, the same approach that I had in my first year of journalism in my sophomore year of high school is similar to my approach now. I guess I'm wiser in applying things. And this is one question where I probably can't judge myself. As one age, one does become